Pastor Matthew Stuckey here, and in this video I'm going to give you a book review of Fox's Book of Martyrs. Fox's Book of Martyrs, written by John Fox, is arguably the most significant Christian book ever written outside of the Bible. It is historically incredibly significant. There are books that have outsold it, but in terms of its importance historically, it's hard to match outside of the Bible. As I'm giving you this review, just giving you an introduction here right now, there's another book I'm going to be bringing up as well called Martyrs' Mirror. And Martyrs' Mirror is a book that came out about 100 years later. So Fox's Book of Martyrs came out in the mid-16th century, really during the height of persecution from the Catholic Church. And then Martyrs' Mirror came out 100 years later, which is basically an Anabaptist book written by Anabaptists. And it talks about a lot of the same persecution and goes through history from the beginning as well. And it highlights persecution during that time period. But these books have some similarities and some differences because Fox's Book of Martyrs is a Protestant book. And during the Protestant Reformation, churches would often have a Bible and then Fox's Book of Martyrs. Those would be the two books that they had. And they would use this book as basically proof that they're being persecuted by the Catholic Church, indicating that they are the true faith. And so that was basically right beside the Bible as being the most significant books. But, you know, the book by the Anabaptists is very different because Anabaptists do not consider themselves Protestant. So they will look at a lot of the same martyrs throughout history. But both the Protestants and the Anabaptists think that if you go back to the beginning, that those original martyrs were actually just like they were in a different time period. And so, me personally, there are things I like about Fox's Book of Martyrs, things I don't like. I am not a Protestant, so I disagree with the main concept behind the book. But I also have a lot of problems with the book Martyrs' Mirror because it certainly teaches the work salvation. And quite honestly, contrary to popular opinion, I don't actually see much similarity between the Anabaptists and modern day what we believe is Baptists. But I would say this, that what matters is what the Bible teaches. So I don't have to prove myself through history and pull up what some church father 1800 years wrote. What matters is, what did Paul the Apostle write? What does the Bible say? And that determines my faith and what I believe. And so let me just kind of go through this book. I'll give you a bit of an introduction, talk about the good, talk about the bad. The name of the book is actually not Fox's Book of Martyrs. This is what it's commonly known as. But the full name is actually Acts and Monuments of These Latter and Perilous Days Touching Matters of the Church. Obviously, people aren't going to remember that title, so it's known as Fox's Book of Martyrs. John Fox is the author, written in 1563 and published by John Day, so in the mid-16th century. And what this book does is it pulls up martyrs from the very beginning, from the time of Christ to our modern day, and gives kind of the stories and information about them. There are a lot of versions of this book. When John Fox first wrote this book, he did not intend it to really be like a fully finished book. Basically, he felt like we're living through persecution, and as more persecutions happen and as more martyrdom took place, we're going to add that to this book. So he had his original edition, and then he ended up adding more, but even after his death, a lot of people made updates to the book and added more martyrs. What ended up taking place is the book became incredibly long, to the point where it's not really going to be read, and it sort of defeats the purpose because it's just too big. And it also is an interesting time in the English language because the font actually greatly changed from the mid-16th century to today. So you're going to read versions with updated font because otherwise it's not going to be that readable. And so there's a multitude of versions of this. It's really, I personally like to always suggest to people reading the original, the true, the authentic, without an abridged version. But the problem is it's hard to really argue what is the authentic real version. And I wouldn't actually recommend it in this case because what takes place is the book is so long and it just gets very boring and drawn out, and it's not like you just want to keep reading every single page, people being martyred and crucified. It just isn't that interesting. Now, I actually originally made a review of this book, and I stopped because I was in the middle of reading Martyrs' Mirror, and what I said in my original review is that the intent of the book is to be basically just a list of martyrs, and it wasn't really meant to be interesting. It's just meant to be a list of martyrs. And given the topic, it would be almost impossible to make it interesting. And of course, you don't necessarily want to read about all these people being martyred. It gets very repetitive, especially as you go outside of characters that you are familiar with in the Bible. But the reason why I redid the review is the fact that reading Martyrs' Mirror, I realized that that's not necessarily 100% correct, because Martyrs' Mirror is actually very interesting. I have a lot of problems with that book, but in terms of them talking about the stories, it is just written at a much higher level. So the author of that book I think his name is Theo Von Bright, if I remember correctly, just was a much better author, in my opinion, than John Fox. Now, Fox's Book of Martyrs was perhaps the most significant book outside the Bible, so obviously the author did a good job. I mean, it served its purpose. I think the purpose was really to motivate Protestants to basically be very against the Catholic Church and to want to defend themselves and stand up for the truth. And to them, it looked like, well, we're being persecuted. That proves that we are correct. But I wouldn't necessarily say that it's impossible to write about martyrs and have it get repetitive, and just because Martyrs' Mirror is actually incredibly interesting. The problem is the false doctrine that is coming up throughout that book, which is a bit of a different case. But I would recommend reading an abridged version, just kind of hitting the main stories, mainly for me during those first 2 centuries, and then during the Protestant Reformation, 16th century on, during that time period would be the areas that are most interesting. For me, we don't really know a lot about characters that lived in the 8th century. So you read about someone getting crucified or killed, we don't even know what they believed. So it's kind of hard to fully feel an appreciation, because I don't know for sure if they were even saved or what they actually believed, okay? Now, I have a lot of problems with this book because I don't consider myself a Protestant, but let me give you some things about the book that are good. There are some things that are good. Obviously, John Fox was not there for the events that took place in the 1st century and 2nd century. What happened is that people had actually written down about those events before, and what he did is really compile the past stories with the present. And it's a very important work because it helped people remember all the martyrdom that actually took place. And I think it's really important because, yes, the Jews are responsible for killing Jesus primarily. Let his blood be on us and on our children. But that doesn't make the Romans innocent. And after that time period, it wasn't the Jews that were really persecuting Christians. It was the Romans. And so this book of Fox's Book of Martyrs is important because it helped popularize the fact that, yes, there was a lot of persecution as a result of the Romans, and that's a large reason why we know this today, because this book was actually so significant. Here's what it says in the book regarding Paul the Apostle. Paul, the great apostle of the Gentiles, was a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, a native of Tarsus in Cilicia, and before his conversion was called Saul. After suffering various persecutions at Jerusalem, Iconium, Lystra, Philippi, and Thessalonica, he was carried prisoner to Rome, where he continued for 2 years and was then released. He afterwards visited the churches of Greece and Rome and preached the gospel in Spain and France, but returning to Rome, he was apprehended by order of Nero and beheaded. Now, of course, the Bible does not say this. It does not say that Paul was beheaded. And so when you read historical information like this, we don't know 100% for sure if it's correct. There's varying levels of degree of confidence of various events. I personally believe there's a lot of truth to these stories. Now, are some of the stories exaggerated to make them more interesting? That's generally kind of the way it works with stories. They just kind of get a little bit bigger as time goes by. But this book is very important because it actually brings up all these martyrdom that actually took place. And a lot of this would be not very common knowledge today if it were not for this book. I personally do believe that is accurate with Paul the Apostle. I believe there's a reason why he knew that the time of his departure was at hand. The fact that he was about to be executed and it was at the end of his life, I personally believe. I personally believe in the early martyrs that there's a lot of truth to it. Now, whether or not the final statements they said right before they died are accurate, or whether those are exaggerations, that's kind of hard to tell, but this book does have real value because it did bring about this importance of the persecution from the Romans. But of course, the Bible speaks about the Jews persecuting the Christians, and then that's kind of the close of the Bible. It's important to know the Romans also did as well historically. In this book, it talks about the first persecution under Nero, starting in AD 67, the second persecution under Domitian, starting in AD 81, the third persecution under Trajan, AD 108, the fourth persecution under Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, AD 162, Another good thing about the book is it mentions the persecution around King James. Now, of course, this book, originally Fox's Book of Martyrs, was written in the mid-16th century. And so King James and the King James Bible came out in 1611. So this is information that was added later on. I read an edition that actually had this information. But this is actually very important information in history, because when King James wanted to have a Bible in the English language, he was actually persecuted by the Catholic Church. There's a lot of confusion about this event because Guy Fawkes and the other Catholics wanted to kill King James. And there's movies such as V for Vendetta, which make vigilante justice like it's a good thing, and they make Guy Fawkes out to be like he's a hero. When in reality, Guy Fawkes was not a hero. He was a Catholic trying to destroy the Word of God actually being put in the English language, and he was actually an evil and a wicked man. And so I think it's great that they have some information about this. People need to understand their history about events and the persecution the Catholic Church had against having the Bible in the English language. And that's one good thing about this book. It's a very strongly pro-Protestant book, which makes it a very anti-Catholic book. And there's a lot of information about Catholic persecution with not just King James, but a lot of persecution through the centuries, and a lot of this information is known because of this book. And so this book does have real value. Here's what it says about the persecution of King James. A conspiracy by the papists for the destruction of James I, the royal family in both houses of Parliament, commonly known by the name of the Gunpowder Plot. And so it gives information. It's very important. Some other things that it mentions that are kind of interesting is it talks about the Waldenses and the Albigenses. These are two of the most famous groups in history because they certainly went through a lot of persecution. So kind of everybody kind of claims them as their own without actually necessarily saying or showing what all their doctrine was. And I think it's very important to understand that just because you're persecuted doesn't mean that you're correct. People get persecuted all the time. Doesn't indicate they're correct. One thing that I think is bad about the book is the treatment of the Anabaptists and how it refers to them. I think it's a bit hypocritical because it will show all the persecution of the Catholic Church to the Protestants, and yet when the Catholic Church is killing Anabaptists, it's like it's not really a big deal. And they will also kind of subtly criticize the Anabaptists for their crazy and wild doctrine. As I said, reading Martyr's Mirror, I don't actually see that much of a connection between the Anabaptists and the modern day Baptists. The Anabaptists certainly seem like they believed you could lose your salvation. And other than having a believer's baptism correct, there's a lot of wild doctrines that they teach that are completely wrong, not what the Bible says. But they were certainly persecuted by the Catholic Church. And what's interesting is sometimes they will list the persecutions of the Catholics to the Anabaptists and kind of subtly criticize the Anabaptists, though. What Fox's Book of Martyrs does not do is talk about how the Protestants were killing Anabaptists. And historically, that's just a fact. And Protestants kept infant baptism, which is completely wrong. And so when Anabaptists and other groups didn't get on board, the Protestants would actually persecute and kill them for not actually getting on board with the doctrine of infant baptism. And so the thing is, the whole book is about how bad the Catholic Church is, and they overlook the fact that they're doing the exact same thing when people are not going on board with their doctrine. And so certainly, historically, the Protestants are not innocent. Were they persecuted? Yes, they were. But they also persecuted other groups that did not line up with their doctrine as well. And they killed people for believers' baptism. And of course, that means they would have killed me if I lived during that time period, because I'm not going to baptize my baby. I believe in believers' baptism by immersion, which the Protestants completely rejected. So I could certainly not endorse this book because I'm not a Protestant. It's not my faith. There are some good things about this book, and I'm glad it gives good historical information of the persecution from the Catholic Church, but I certainly don't line up with the beliefs that they're teaching. Here's what it says in Acts 8, verse 36. And as they went on their way, they came unto a certain water, and the eunuch said, See, here is water. What doth hinder me to be baptized? And Philip said, If thou believest with all thine heart, thou mayest. And he answered and said, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. You have to believe with all your heart to be baptized. And he commanded the chariot to stand still, and they went down both into the water, both Philip and the eunuch, and he baptized him. So we see baptism by immersion, after believing, This is clearly what the Bible teaches. There's no instance of infant baptism in the Word of God. And so you have to understand that with this book, it is a Protestant book. And what you have to understand about the Protestant movement, I grew up Protestant, but the Protestant movement basically just wanted to reform the Catholic Church. They didn't hate the Catholic Church. They believed in a universal church. They just wanted to make some changes, and they kept a lot of heresies like infant baptism, and they kind of just added Calvinism. They made some good changes, but then they added Calvinism. And so you could look at Protestants as being largely Calvinistic Catholics, to be honest. And of course, Calvinism is just a complete heresy. And so they basically added Calvinism. I mean, historically, you can look at the fact that Martin Luther wrote the book, as in a response to Erasmus. Erasmus wrote The Freedom of the Will. Then Martin Luther wrote The Bondage of the Will. And of course, John Calvin comes along, and he's a Protestant teaching this Calvinism. And so they make some changes to the Catholic Church, and they make a few good changes, but they keep a lot of heresies. They keep infant baptism, and they just add Calvinism to it. So, if I had a bookshelf, I mean, I read most of my books on Kindle, but if I had a bookshelf with 10 books, then Fox's Book of Martyrs would be on that shelf because of its significance and because there's some good and important information. Certainly not a book I would endorse because I disagree with the primary message of the Protestants being the true faith. But there is some good information, and so I can't really give a pure rating. I guess I'd give it a mixed rating of 6 or something like that. There's some good information. It's not the most interesting book in the world, but I am glad that the book was written because otherwise a lot of the famous martyrdom that took place in the early days and as a result of the Roman Catholic Church might have largely been forgotten in history for the most part. So it is good the book was written, in my opinion. Not really a book I could recommend. The book Martyr's Mirror, I don't think that's a perfect book either. I'll do a review on that coming up in the future. But anyways, that is my review of Fox's Book of Martyrs. I'd recommend reading it if you enjoy reading and you want to read historically famous books. Just go and do it with the understanding that they're wrong on the baptism. They're a bit misleading and misrepresenting the position of Anabaptists and some of the situations that take place there. And, of course, we're not Protestants as Baptists. I don't believe the Catholic Church was ever correct. I believe there's always been true believers and true churches that have existed throughout history. Even if the Anabaptists are not that group, even if the Waldenses and Albigenses are not that group, even if they're forgotten in history, unknown and yet well-known. Unknown on earth, maybe nobody knows their name, but I guarantee you there's always been true believers because I will establish my church and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. That is the promise of God. Anyways, thank you and God bless.